Hello, everybody, and welcome to this series of debates hosted by the European Environment Agency on COVID-19 and environment and climate. We are grateful for your joining us here today for a 1-hour talk, and it's already the 7th talk in this series, where we look at the impacts and the prospects and links between this COVID debate and several issues and topics that are related to climate and environment. Today's session is focusing on the links between climate change and the COVID, and I'm very glad to welcome you, our guests, and we have two distinguished speakers, panelists with us today that I'm going to introduce in a second. These debates are scheduled in a form that we have introductory statements by our panelists. We will then have questions, answers, and you as the audiences are very welcome and invited to ask your questions that we will answer here then live. If I now may please invite our distinguished two panelists, which is Jim Skea, Professor Jim Skea. He's a professor at the Imperial College in London for sustainable energy, and you work there at the Center for Environment Policy. You're also well known for being a co-chair of the Working Group 3 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this Working Group 3 covers mitigation of climate change, actually. But we also know that, Jim, you have a very strong link to policy. You are the chair of the Scottish Just Transition Commission as well, and also a founding member of the UK's Committee on the Climate Change. So welcome to you, Jim. Looking forward to talk to you soon. And our second panelist today is Jaroslav Mysiak. And welcome to you. And you work as a director of the research division on risk assessment and adaptation at the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change that is based in Italy. And you are also an expert in linking climate change and risk reduction and disaster risk reduction work. So you have worked on that a lot, Jaroslav. And last not least, you are also an expert in the European Environment Agency's Topic Center on Climate Change Impacts, Vulnerability and Adaptation. Welcome to you too. And without further ado, I would like to give both of you the option for making some top points that you want to convey in this context of climate change to our audience. Jim, if I can give the floor to you.
Okay, thanks, Katja, and thanks for mentioning Scotland's Just Transition Commission, because I think this is I've learned a lot from that. It's been charged by the Scottish ministers with providing on advice on how Scotland gets to a net zero target by 2045 on 75% emission reductions by 2030 in a way that takes account of fairness, equity, and all the inevitable social and economic consequences of the transition. And the ministers just asked us to produce a report in the middle of this year looking at a green COVID recovery through a just transition lens. And I have to say, in many ways, that sort of practical process has given me more insights than the more scientific work through IPCC. So a lot of my insights are actually going to come from that background, the more on the ground stuff. So my first point I'd like to make is about emission levels. And I think we need to acknowledge what we don't know. We really do not know what the medium to long-term consequences of the COVID crisis will be on emission levels. The IEA has estimated that global CO2 emissions will have fallen by about 7% this year as a result of COVID and all the impacts on activity, particularly in transport. But of course, CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere, and all that means is that CO2 is accumulated 7% more slowly. CO2 concentrations are still going up. And it's worthwhile reflecting that a low energy demand scenario assessed by IPCC sees emissions from fossil fuel and industry going down by 7% every year on year until 2050. And this is a very sobering thought. given that the disruption that COVID has caused. Though, of course, a planned transition can only be more benign than an unplanned transition. That's actually a major theme of our just transition work. In the longer term, it's all going to depend on the extent to which the changed practices we've all gone through, working from home, these Zoom meetings, aversion to public transport, retailing patterns, how much they persist. And there are, of course, many different scenarios that people are testing out. But my own guess is that what COVID will do is effectively delay the emission pathways that we might otherwise have been on by a small number of years. That's my hunch, my guess on it. When what we do need to do is to monitor all the key socioeconomic indicators to see which path we appear to be moving on. But of course, the other thing, and this brings me on to my second point, is that a path isn't something we anticipate. We can choose our path as well. And that brings me on to green recovery. And one of the things that our just transition work has shown, that many measures that were already win-win measures from a climate change perspective are becoming win-win-win measures in the context of COVID recovery. So we're thinking about measures that can be turned around very quickly and help to create employment. So specific examples: investing in the energy efficiency of our homes and other buildings. It lowers emissions, it avoids waste, saves money, and puts people back into work. And in the land sector, there are other analogies that perhaps we can see in Northern Europe. Practices such as afforestation and peatland restoration fulfill the same role potentially of creating employment quickly. And alongside that, I think there's a need for education, training, and building up the necessary supply chains. And that's particularly important to reach out for younger people who've been particularly hard hit by the COVID crisis, among the most vulnerable groups. And my third message is about green recovery, but it's about sectors that have been badly hit by the COVID crisis. And in fact, it is high carbon sectors such as aviation and coal and oil that have been particularly badly hit in an economic sense. Renewables have stacked up well, while coal and gas have been driven off electricity systems at the margin. Though I might say in Britain, I say there's been some interesting trends where the question of absorbing that amount of renewables has proved challenging in an interesting way, because the costs of balancing the system tripled during 2020 because of trying to get renewables onto the system. At the same time, the reduced demand for transport fuels has driven down the price of oil, and that has led to large-scale redundancies in the extractive part of the oil and gas sector. So one of the things that we've been thinking about is how the high-level technical skills in these sectors can be redeployed to help build a net zero economy. And there's one really good example from Scotland. The Oil and Gas Technology Centre in Aberdeen, which had been focused on driving down production costs in the North Sea, has now joined forces with the UK's offshore renewable energy catapult, which focuses on offshore wind, to produce a comprehensive plan, which they've called Reimagining a Net Zero North Sea, to think about how offshore capabilities could be redeployed to support climate change, climate goals, and at the same time maintain and enhance employment. So 3 very fast message, 1 on the impact emissions, 2 on different aspects of green recovery, and I'll turn back to you now, Katja.
Thanks a lot of food for thought, Jim here, and I'm turning to you now, Jaroslav, maybe coming in with your top messages for kicking off the discussion.
Thank you very much, Katja. Thank you for having me, and good afternoon to all those that listen to this conversation. So yes, my first message would relate to the risk assessment. We are doing, together with European Environment Agency and other actors, we are investing a lot into improving the climate risk assessment. So my first message is about the similarities between the ongoing pandemic and the climate risk. So there are many of similarities that we can observe. Both are stemming from physical shocks, which translate into number of socioeconomic impacts. Both are systemic. That means they produce a sort of spillover effect and knock-on effect almost on everybody in every economic sector, on every community. And this is even reinforced throughout our interconnected world. They are non-linear. That means that the impacts grow disproportionately and somehow might reach even the catastrophic threshold. And both are risk multipliers. That means they exacerbate vulnerabilities that we already have. And this is something that would perhaps I would take it as the second point, because exactly, you know, the systemic nature and the regressive nature of the risk means that those that are already vulnerable and those that are marginalized are affected disproportionately. So the existing vulnerabilities are even more exacerbated, and the lockdown that we have been going through and all the impacts are disproportionately affecting the poor, the marginalized, or some otherwise disadvantaged parts of population. So there are two things. So the first is we need to better understand the risk, the causes, the drivers, and we need to understand the disproportional impact. And unfortunately, especially this higher order, the knock-on effect, the systemic risk is not yet fully understood. I mean, we have made significant progress, both of understanding the impacts of climate change and disaster risk in general. But I think there's more to be done in terms of understanding the interconnections. And this would lead me to the third point. And for this, I have a couple of slides. And this is, of course, the Green Deal is a new agenda of, you know, how to deal with complex systemic risk, how we deal with risk drivers contributing to climate change and vulnerabilities. So as a part of the Green Deal, and as a part of the European Research and Innovation Framework, Horizon Europe, European Commission established a so-called mission-oriented innovation and research. So there are 5 missions that have been identified last year. So they are on cancer, health and cancer, soil, oceans, cities. And the one that I would like to mention a little bit more in that is about climate adaptation and societal transformation. And the key message is we cannot continue in the same way as we did in the past. We really need a step change in the way how we are addressing risk and how we are managing our natural resources. So this is the transformation. Jim mentioned transition, energy transition. The energy transition needs to be accompanied by societal transformation, social change. So this board, and I'm honored to serve as a member and rapporteur of this board, which is led by Connie Hedegaard, the former commissioner on climate change, has developed this set of recommendations. And this document is available here under this link. I encourage you to go and look into what we have suggested. But they are basically 3 objectives that we are looking into, and I hope you see my slide. The first is to prepare Europe to deal with climate disruptions and assist all citizens, communities, and regions in better understanding, preparing for, managing climate risk. So this is really, the mission has the higher ambition to deliver something for every citizen, every community, and every region in terms of access to climate risk knowledge, in terms of capacity to develop risk management plans, and ensure that the critical social and community infrastructure is safe and accessible during the crisis. The second objective is accelerate the transformation to climate resilient future, and that will be done by supporting 200 European communities and regions in creating a development vision where we want to be by 2030 and beyond, and the adaptation transformative pathways, how to get there by building solution within the safe planetary boundaries. And finally, the third objective is to develop 100 deep demonstration projects that are meant to scale up the solution that have been tested and have been proved to be useful for building resilience. And those deep demonstration, how we call them, are expected to deliver on the cross-border value and scaling up the solution. So this is this mission has been proposed. The European Commission is now, together with the board, working on the implementation, and we hope it will be finally accepted and funded as a part of the Horizon Europe program next year. Thank you very much. Back to you, Katja.
Thank you, Jaroslav, and thank you both for these kind of slightly different entries into the discussion. I would like to maybe start off by coming back a little bit to the points you made on, Jim, first on the impacts. And the one figure that struck me in your intervention was about, you said if we were to go on the long-term trajectory to zero carbon, we would need a 7% reduction of emissions every year. And what we can see short-term and the COVID effects are actually in that order now. So I would just like to ask you, some say about that fact that this crisis also shows us how much we need to adapt and change. But at the same time, we all know that that cannot be the model for the future. So I would like to have your reflections of what actually is the learnings from what change can happen to a society, and how strong should it be in the future, or can we go on like that to go on the carbon trajectory? What's your reflection there, Jim?
Yeah, Katja, just to say, of course, this wasn't a prediction of what was needed. This was one scenario. And there are other scenarios in which there's a little more delay and a little slower reduction in emissions from fossil fuels in industry. But the price you pay is that if you're going to hit 1.5 or well below 2 degrees globally, you would then need to rely on negative emissions later in the 21st century to keep you there. So that was, the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees warming was very clear on that kind of trade-off. We can, just from the physics and chemistry, you can figure out, what that choice actually is. One of the things I guess I would be concerned about with starting emission reductions at that pace very quickly is actually that very just transition kind of question about the impact on groups. I mean, because many of the longer term models that IPCC assesses were really designed to look 20, 30, 40, 50 years into the future, not to do the next few months and the next 3 to 5 years. So I think we need a much better understanding of what that kind of pace of change would be and the implications. What does it do for the employment of younger people? How quickly can you retrain people from an old industry and get them into a low carbon sector? And I think once you get down to the more practical level, which we've done on the Just Transition Commission in Scotland, you become much more aware of these kind of practical issues. I mean, just to give one particular example, if you're certified to be a diver on a North Sea oil rig, you need to be recertified to do the same job on an offshore wind platform. This is not, these are the kind of just very crude institutional factors that needed to be shifted to make the kind of changes. We can do a lot, we can move down and we can move quickly, but I think 7% per year, year on year, especially for the first year, if you're doing it deliberately, is really quite a challenging ask.
That is true. And Jaroslav, maybe also following on from your intervention on the needs to be adaptive and to really also look at the societal transformation towards the climate adaptation. What is your own view of how much we have been quite adaptable in this crisis as societies? And is that the level of adaptation we would need in the future? So how do you judge us in our resilience and the ability to adapt during such a crisis now for the future?
Thank you very much for that question. So, if we speak about, what we have achieved in terms of adaptation, there's of course a lot. The first European adaptation strategy was released 2013. Some countries have implemented their own strategies before. So by now we have basically all EU member states have an adaptation strategy, particularly focusing how to reinforce resilience. Some of the member states have also action plan for adaptation strategy, for adaptation, and so on. So there's been, a lot has been done in terms of adaptation planning and in diffuse adaptation of the business sectors, of the governmental-driven adaptation, and in some communities as well. But if your question is related to the COVID and the COVID, what the COVID has shown us in terms of how well we are prepared and resilient, then the answer is, of course, mixed. The first, I mean, of course, there was what we have seen in many countries right after the outbreak of the pandemics, the massive outbreak in January and February, was a rather good compliance of citizens with the restrictions. Many have shown a deep understanding why this was needed, and this comes probably because the risk was a little bit unknown and it was fearful. So many have feared about the possible consequences. We knew little about the health consequences and how to protect ourselves. So there was a good alignment, behind the governmental policies, how to reduce the impact of the pandemics. As we are now in the second wave, probably we see also a different type of behavior. We see those that don't believe or somehow question whether the restrictions are still the best response to the pandemic, whether the pandemic is in place and to what extent, and so on. And this type of denial or social, reconstruction of the causes or reinterpretation of the threat, we have seen also in climate change. Of course, we have, we are facing with public understanding of risk that's common among the pandemics and the climate change. So I would think, I mean, of course, we have seen that the measures to respond to pandemics were at the beginning heterogeneous. So not that it came out of the blue, the risk was known. What was perhaps surprising, how poorly are we prepared to the pandemics. But more and more, what I see is a good coordination across the regions, across the EU member states, also under the leadership of the European Commission. So I would say that the way how we are managing the pandemics is getting better as we enter or go out of the second wave and face the third one. And of course, the vaccine and vaccination, there was a strong response, international response to doing research, getting the vaccine and the prepared distribution of the vaccine. So I would see those are positive signs for the response. Thank you.
Thank you. So there we can learn. That is very good. While I'd like to move to a second round of questions on what we do next and recover, I would like to remind our audience to still post their questions. We will come back to those soon. And also that you are all aware that this session will be also recorded and we will make it available for later view. So if I may, I would like to move now to the what next type of question, and also referring back to you, Jim, again. And I heard you made comments already in the early spring and the spring when we started this lockdown measures about this recovery needed to be green. And you made the points in your introduction also about why that is the case and what are the sectors that are most affected here. I would like maybe to ask you, how do you see that at the moment? So we have the recovery packages in many countries at EU level, substantive packages. Are we delivering on them being green in your view, or what's your initial assessment here?
Yeah, well, what I am struck by, I think the message that I gave in my introduction about some things between win-win-win has probably been picked up very, very strongly. So in my own country, there have been, very significant packages put in place because everyone has spotted the opportunity very quickly and recognized the chances there. I think there are some more challenges about what you might call the longer terms, like innovation and some of the bigger technical fixes, because clearly we're going to get into a situation where public finances are going to be much more constrained over the next few years. We've piled up an awful lot of debt, and that is going to make it a much bigger challenge, I think, to invest in the things, we need to invest in infrastructure, electricity grids. Digital connectivity is something that's really important for establishing resilience as well as on the mitigation side. I know it's not everybody's taste, but there are issues like carbon capture and storage, and the way that hydrogen could play into energy systems. And these are all things that I think that governments are going to struggle a bit more to support because of the pressure on public finances. I think we're lucky that we've seen a lot of progress on renewable costs. The fact that solar and wind costs have come down so much means that we can hope just a little more that the market will run itself in terms of renewable energy and won't need quite so much public support. I think it probably needs some, kind of institutional support, but less in terms of euros overall. So I think the short-term things I think people have understood and will be getting on with. I think it's the longer-term investment in innovation and technology that will be challenging because of public finances.
Yes, thanks for that. And I just maybe that gives me also an opportunity to refer to a piece of work that the agency just published earlier this year. You might know that we are the body who also tracks progress against the climate and energy targets. And while we say on the short-term targets on renewables and greenhouse gases, we are actually on track. We are not on track on the energy efficiency, and that is definitely also a big investment domain. And we are also not on track yet for the long-term targets. But that's just a side message. Jaroslav, if I may turn to you also now on this point about recovery packages and adaptation. We also know that adaptation measures are also very costly. I don't know if you have managed to have a look at some of these recovery packages and how strong these links are made today to adaptation. Did you see any hopes there? Did you see investments coming through?
Yes, I definitely did. And I'll just permit me to flesh out another report of the European Environment Agency that was published just earlier this year, and that draw a picture where we stand with adaptation effort, a comprehensive overview about what the different countries do and have done over the past, and that was released in October, on October 13. So this is another reference that is perhaps useful to look into. Now, of course, we have seen the recovery package. I have seen I haven't seen the plans. I have seen the guidance that was produced by European Commission in order to draw those plans. So there are a number of opportunities. I mean, of course, there are some, as we are adapting to the new normal, there are some temporary adjustment, like getting used to the teleworking, greater reliance on digital channels and so on during the lockdowns. We are seeing also more emphasis on checking the risk affecting the supply chains, and also the tendency of the financial institution and markets to better price the risk, including the risk of climate change, but in the first place, the pandemics. Of course, the recovery package is still a great opportunity to start doing things differently. And because of the huge investment right now, and I agree with Jim, there will be, the debt will catch up with us a little bit later, so there will be difficulties. So it's really wise to think how to invest the recovery money in the most effective and efficient way. And that might be used for governments to build a capacity to model, understand risk, and assess the potential economic impacts of climate change. Also investment into resilience and decarbonization, investment in the renewable energy infrastructure, retrofitting buildings as we have. This is a part of the Green Deal as well. Developing technologies to decarbonize heavy carbon industry and so on. And of course, a return from those investment might both reduce the risk and create new sources of employment and growth. But there are other opportunities which are more soft, right? It's education, training, it's engagement with citizen, designing, planning, intervention, getting everybody on board, designing, the the cities we want to live in the future. So all these, I could mention some examples. During the lockdown, Milan city has turned about 30 kilometers of roads into pedestrian zone. So there's because if you use efficiently the time of the lockdown, you still can think and negotiate and engage people in designing something that is really a step change away from the past practice. And because of the windows of opportunity, now the citizens understand the risk, the magnitude and the systemic nature of risk. So there's greater acceptance of certain intervention for which we can demonstrate, the win-win, the societal benefits and so on.
Yes,
Thank
and
you,
thanks a lot. We need to maybe carry those then through to the new normal, as we call it today. I can see that Gülçin has joined. That means that we have some questions now from the audience. Is that correct, Gülçin?
Yes, exactly. So the team behind the scenes have been monitoring questions, and I'm here to kind of forward them to our panelists. There are a couple of remarks. Oleg is saying that it would be interesting to see the written materials that you mentioned during your debate. So some of the EEA reports the team can mention, but maybe you could refer to where our viewers can find this material. He also says that it was the EU program of emission reductions under the acronym 2020-20. What about how successful was it, and how would it correspond to current issues in emission reduction? So whether the previous approach would be relevant for the future. I'll give them in bulks. So another question is from Todd. He says, we know that we've seen a temporary drop in emissions in cities especially, but have you seen any actual negative effects on climate change linked to the pandemic or the environment, I guess? Does increased plastics use have an impact? And maybe a question also on from Amy on the points that you've just raised. What is the likely time frame for seeing positive change? And are there any estimates of how much we need to invest? So I think I'll stop at this for this round.
Thanks a lot. That is quite that's quite a package to answer.
I'm happy to repeat if needed.
No, I think we can maybe, who feels, Jim, do you feel ready to answer this question on the EU emission targets, 2020 targets, or yeah, I'm not sure if you are, but if you are, then try.
Well, yeah. Why don't I come in? Just to say, if it hadn't been for lockdown, COP26 for the Framework Convention would have been taking place these last 2 weeks. And in fact, they've been running a set of online climate dialogues to talk about issues. And I was lucky enough to participate in the one on the pre-2020 ambition round table, where many of these issues came up as to how far we're going. And I have to say the G77 group launched a fairly comprehensive criticism of how much developed countries had actually achieved so far at, at that round table. But I do think Europe is has been a good place. I mean, broadly speaking, the targets have been met at the emissions level. But I think one thing that's important to emphasize is, we've kind of done the easy bit so far. And honestly, with the falling cost of renewable energy, what we've achieved so far has been much easier, and the more difficult tasks remain to be carried out in the future. So I think for me, the bigger challenge is going to be where we get to by 2030, because we do have to set ambitious emission target levels if we're going to make net zero by the middle of the century credible. And really, I am waiting for countries to come up with the kind of practical measures and implementation that will allow these ambitions to do, because there's a lot of aspiration and less delivery at the moment. One other point in the questions I might quick up is the negative impacts, and clearly the question, the question of plastic use. And I just say in my own household with the grocery deliveries, I feel a great sense of guilt about the amount of plastic we are now getting through as a result of COVID. One other thing that I would mention is the question of potential aversion to public transport use, which has come up in the just transition side, and whether we will get people back to that. And I think that's going to be a big challenge, not only because in rural areas, it's actually often the case that bus operators have found routes to be unprofitable and may have pulled out of some areas, making people more reliant on private transport and vehicles to deal with it. So there are definitely negatives that we need to look out for. It isn't all positive.
Yes. Thanks. And Jaroslav, I was hoping maybe you have also some examples or reflections on these negative effects, and maybe also on the time frame. On, I don't know if you have ideas on by when would we be ready to adapt, or by when would be on the right path. That is a very difficult one.
Yes, thank you. Just, in terms of how much is needed in terms of adaptation, there's a recent report of the European Commission, the Joint Research Center, the PESETA-4 study that looks into the major extreme climate risk and look into baseline scenarios, how much might increase the damage and loss from these extremes, and by how much we might reduce those impact stemming from climate change by adapting. And there are 4 different types of adaptation. Technically speaking, rising dikes, for example, against the flood risk, is still increasing the retention capacity in the landscape, and so on. So there are those numbers, how much is needed in order to invest, and what might be the impact of economic impacts is really differentiated by hazard, is different for across the regions, across the communities and member states in Europe. So a single number is probably not very much helpful. Of course, there are significant efforts needed to adapt, and the magnitude of the investment will depend on how efficient, effective we will be to reducing the emissions in the coming years. Now, regarding the negative impacts on environment, there might be, and Jim has rightly pointed to use of plastics and perhaps turning to using own car because not trusting the public transportation. But I think the real and the highest impact are on health, and not necessarily because you are infected by COVID-19, but because of the anxiety, because of the fear, what the future holds for you, because of the expected economic downturn, and so on. So there is a huge, impact, even on domestic violence. There were reports about domestic violence being increased. So I think, in the first place, I think the health impact, we need really to understand better how the health impact propagate and what does it mean for cohesion of communities and families.
Yeah. Thanks. And maybe if I may say, just to respond to this question by Oleg, where you find the material that you were both referring to, maybe it's good to remind our audiences that Jim, your work at the Imperial College in London, and there you would find probably the reference to your work. And you, Jaroslav, it's at the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, where you would probably also find the material that you are referring to. But we can definitely provide that later to the audiences as well. Gülçin, do we have more questions?
Yes, we do. I'll give them to you in a batch again. So we have a question from Tobias. Which factor is providing the biggest effect and danger to climate change? That's all he has shared. Emmanuel is asking, COVID brought a big shock to our society, affecting some people more than others and forcing us to question our vulnerability. How likely are these measures that you mentioned at European and national level make change happen, and if we face more and more shocks like this? And maybe last question for this round is from Lucine. How can we establish the right balance between helping companies and people avoid poverty through furlough schemes, cash checks, eat out to help plans, and investing in the Green Deal? At Jaroslav, this question is for Jaroslav. So, thank you.
Thank you. So on the biggest effects, who wants to answer that? What about you, Jim?
Yeah. Well. In terms of effects on emissions, I mean, the work that IPCC assesses, and many literature say that over time, the biggest impact on global emissions so far has comes from the level of economic activity. That's a long-term effect. And I think what COVID has done is kind of, emphasize that that perhaps works in the short term as well, though the dynamics of short and long-term change, I think, are completely different. But I don't think the kind of the macro picture doesn't help. You need to burrow into the detail. What has it done to transport in the transport sector? What has it done in the residential sector? What work it has done in terms of industry? And the work that the IEA published in the middle of this year showed quite a variety of responses. So, for example, if you go down to lockdown in the middle of summer, you will probably see emissions going down because of transport. But in higher latitudes, if the lockdown takes place in the middle of winter, then people will be staying at home and keeping their heating on longer, and you perhaps see an increase in emissions, especially if it's people who previously used public transport with a fairly low carbon impact. So it's a very varied kind of picture I think that you've got overall. I think that's probably as far as I can go. One other point that I might flag, Jaroslav has mentioned the issue of people putting in more pedestrian zones and cycling lanes, which is certainly true where I am in central London. But just to say, there has been a big pushback, and a big cycle lane along Kensington High Street is now being removed because of protests from drivers who see traffic jams and nobody sitting on the cycle lane beside them. So this question of pushback and reaction and public attitudes and how it plays out as the crisis evolves, I think is going to be quite critical.
Yes, Jaroslav, what about you? Do you want to respond to this balance, how to avoid poverty, from Lucy?
Lucy, thank you very much for that question. I mean, I couldn't imagine an easier question to answer. We are struggling with, we know that the current economic and social system are doing poorly with reducing inequalities. We see increasing gap between the wealthy and marginalized groups of population. That touches upon really the core of the public policies and the shared vision, I mean, that we have about the economic, how equitable the economic development should be. Regarding the vulnerabilities that we see, to what extent we have really managed to reduce those. There's a mix evidence-based. I mean, adaptation is of course built up by predominantly local measures, what the local communities and businesses do in order to adapt. So it's not easy. There's no one single indicator that could be used to measure, right? The mitigation has a easier job because there's a concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. In adaptation, there's no single indicator that we could use to measure the resilience or the vulnerability. And of course, we need to consider the resilience and vulnerability from dynamic point of view. Definitely the resources that we are spending now on pandemic and building back better, we hope that will contribute to reducing the vulnerabilities, and we will reduce some drivers of the risk. But on the other hand, they are also eating into our resources that will be missing in the future. So of course, from this dynamic point of view, there's no, it's extremely important to understand how to measure progress made by adaptation policies, but it's also very difficult task because you need to have a grassroots almost measurement what has been done by different communities, regions and states. So the report that I mentioned that look into what has been done in some countries at the city level. There are good practice examples that might be followed by others, but it's not a systematic assessment at the community level, and that's really something very difficult to do. There will be a global stocktake of adaptation, which is due by 2023, and
Yes.
and we are looking into how to deliver those messages and the progress made. Thank you.
And that's definitely also a topic for the future, linking also back to your commission on just transition in Scotland and other places. I think that will be a topic of the future.
Yeah, could I comment on one thing, Katja?
Please.
Which is this question about where assistance should be directed. And I mentioned in my introductory remarks, that some of the hardest hit sectors had been the high carbon sectors. On one thing, there will be a big temptation to put money into high carbon sectors to, as it will, rescue them from the situation. And I'm thinking particularly of things like aviation and, again, some of the fossil fuel industries. And obviously, you do need to put money in the short term so that people can pay their rents and their groceries. But on the other hand, you need to have an eye on the long term at the same time and make sure that the money that we spend is not building in high carbon lock-in that will lock us in the future. So I think that's quite an important to get across. I don't envy politicians because it's a very difficult balancing act to pull off.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Jim. We have time for one more round, I think, Gretchen, from the audience questions.
Yes, actually, some of them are feedback on some of the reflections and tie in quite nicely to what you were just saying. Claudia says that certainly there's been a reduction in papers and prints during the pandemic at schools across the world. But he's actually asking what the day after the pandemic will be like. Will we go back to paper? Franco is saying a point that you had made earlier, Jim, saying that the global state of the climate showed that although there was a reduction in emissions, greenhouse gas levels were rising in 2020. So reductions did not necessarily mean lower concentrations. Oleg, again, is actually saying that can we state, based on your discussion, that mobility remains the key point of today's emission reductions agenda? And last point, maybe I'll just share, which goes to this global effort that you were also mentioning. Does the EEA collaborate with China in their efforts to reach the 2050 carbon neutrality, since China made the statement to go CO2 neutral in 2060? So maybe you could take, it's not the EEA as such, but Europe, maybe you could reflect a little bit on that.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting. So maybe we should start with this point about pushback after. Are we going back to normal with the emissions, with the behaviors, or can we sustain some of the lower emissions or lower path in our behaviors after the crisis? Who can come back to this? Will there be a full pushback also linking to these transport emissions especially?
Yeah, do you want me to come in first, Katja?
Yes,
because I think in terms of use of paper, within our technical support unit for IPCC, we found a big generational divide there, is that our younger people have entirely left paper behind them already.
Yes.
And it's people like me with more silver in their hair who've struggled more and still has a printer in the corner of their room to keep on top of things. So I think it is a challenge. Once you learn to do without it, I think you can function. I think one of the things, I don't think the new normal will be just a reversion to the old normal, because I think we've learned some things in the process we had with about a month's notice to run a lead authors meeting for 250 people for IPCC when immediately the lockdown happened. And we quickly learned and monitored the experience that some things work better virtually than they do physically. We can get better engagement in some ways because you can bring more people into a meeting. But what you do need to look out for is the digital connectivity issue, which is particularly affected colleagues in developing countries. And I think if, for meetings we run in the future, we will actually use a hybrid format. We will mix some early virtual activities with a physical meeting later on to make best use of it. And I think that makes a difference. The other thing in international aviation, a very small number of people account for a huge chunk of the emissions and the long haul trips. And whether these people are affected and will allow their behaviour to revert, I think, is absolutely critical. So that's things like us, actually, IPCC, UNFCCC, how you run international meetings.
That travel.
Yeah,
That's
exactly,
true.
exactly,
Yes.
yeah.
Very good. Yeah, thanks. Jaroslav, what about your reflections? Is there a full pushback, or what can we do to maintain some of the behaviors now?
I think there will be definitely a sort of the tendency to come to the previous status quo. I think it really will depend of how serious the businesses or the organization think about the health and security of the employee or the carbon footprint and so on. What we have seen, for example, is the smart organization that are open for innovation, that are looking for new solution, have really used the opportunity of the COVID in order to redesign their practices. Or they invest more into smart working. If you are under the regime of smart working, then you might also choose not to live in a city, which is the hotspot for pandemic risk, but you might move outside of the city, perhaps to the suburbs or towns. We have many nice towns in Italy that have been abandoned, and they are creating now the opportunities for the people that move away from cities and look for a secure environment with digital connection, of course. This is an enabling factor that where they can live, have a higher standard of life, and still can work as they are used to during the pandemic. So we do see in some cities there's the tendency to create a sort of a network or invest into suburbs or abandoned towns and reinforce the transportation, reinforce the digital connection in order to distribute the population over larger areas and perhaps create a better condition for life. So, but it really depends how innovation friendly the organization is or the business. And there's, for everybody, there's a huge scope for looking into innovation, sustainable business innovation, identify the ways how to take the challenge seriously and prepare for the next wave of the risk.
Yes, so thanks. I think with that, and I want to just say also that people mention here also the global dimension and the connection with other countries, which is an important point as well. I have to wrap up, or we have to wrap up already this discussion. So I'd like to give both of our panelists now the opportunity to make some final remarks, thoughts that come to your mind within this discussion. And yeah, give it to you first, Jim, again.
Yeah, okay. I can't remember which Greek philosopher said, the start of all knowledge is knowing what you don't know. And I do think that, we need to keep an eye on the short-term and medium-term indicators to see where we're going. Many people are trying to develop scenarios for how we come out of this, but they really are scenarios and not predictions. And we really need to keep a very close monitoring of what's happening at the moment in order to get a better sense of what the medium to long-term path would be. And I just echo one other point I made in the opening remarks. It's not just a case of anticipating the future. We can help to make it as well and influence the future. So, I mean, that for me really highlights the importance of green recovery. There are just many things you can do to get us out of the situation we're in at the moment that will also help to put us on the pathway for the long term. So that's a bit of an optimistic picture, but we need to be very active about it and keep having these discussions so that we identify the ways forward.
Thanks a lot, Jim.
Yeah,
what about your final points? Go ahead, Jaroslav.
I would stay on the same line. I mean, positive messages. We should really not permit to get to the previous normal and take the best out of what we have learned, what we can do in order to reduce our carbon footprint, what we can do for us in order to better prepare and better cope with risk and increase our resilience, and also what we can do for the others, right? And that's the vulnerable part, what the neighbor, caring for each other, one another. That's extremely important. So in disaster risk reduction domain, we have this insight. After the disaster strike, there is a window of opportunity for greater awareness, for greater acceptance that we really need to change the way we are looking at the things, we are dealing with risk and responding to risk. So we should really use this window of opportunity that comes at very high cost. I mean, we didn't seek that, but once it's there, we should really use the opportunity and translate it into a deep reflection and action taken in order to reduce the risk. So the building back better or reconstruct better is a principle that has been promoted by United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, but also by European Commission, by smart governments. It's really a good opportunity for working both on the decarbonization, ambitious decarbonization strategy, and resilience building strategy. So transition and transformation towards a more resilient, carbon-free future.
Thank you, Jaroslav. And with this, I'd like to maybe make one comment as a final wrapping up the session, is that all of us and all of you who are normally members of the climate community at this time of the year would be very busy normally in the climate conventions of the UN Climate Convention that would have just met a few weeks, 2 weeks ago, I think in Glasgow. That was the original scheduling. This now happens next year, so we have a bit of time to still reflect. But I'd like to make this link that this time of the year is a very normally busy year for the climate community, and at EU level, we are having these elements of the Green Deal that deal with climate change, so a new climate law, a new climate pact, the funds that we are releasing that are really ambitious and that are also now going through here. And I would like to make one point that I heard in the context of the Glasgow COP, that we also touched a little bit here on the global dimension. And this is about that we also need to maintain the commitments to support the least developed countries in their climate ambitions with the commitments we made there, that we don't forget about those and we also keep those going forward. And if that is fine, then I'd like to basically now thank the two of you very much for being with us here today. Thank our audiences for the active contributions and your interest. And thank our teams behind the scenes also that have made this possible. We will, as I said in the beginning, we will store this session that will be available further on Facebook. You will find background material that our speakers have published and are referenced in their respective institutions, but you are happy to ask us more questions. And with this, I think it remains me to wish you all a peaceful time and a reflective time that we already have. And thanks a lot. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And stay
Bye.
healthy. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.